Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Highgate Cemetery. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here with all of you this evening, because this event happened really just about a chance discussion when Becky and Catherine had been to visit the cemetery and said, why isn't Stuart on the map? And it's a really good question, and the answer is really simple, in that you've seen his grave. It's in an area of recent burials, and so no one in that area is on the map, because we're trying to balance the visitors against the bereaved people. And in due course, of course, when that area is, I guess, matured a little, when there's fewer immediately bereaved people, that area will be put on the map, and the street will certainly be there. There's a really good question, because the cemetery has over 170,000 people buried here, and they all have their stories, and all of those stories are interesting. Some stories are little stories, they might be a bit more technical stories, and some stories are really good and very interesting. Of course, Stuart's story is a really good and interesting story. So I'll pass over to Becky to talk to you next. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming here today. And so how excited the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust is to be collaborating with the Stuart Hall Foundation on this wonderful artwork with Trevor Mathison. Thank you very much.
Well, warmest of welcomes to everybody here in the chapel, and of course everyone also at home. Just before I start, I've got a few things that I've been instructed to say by Harriet, so I'll just say those. So the artwork, the soundscape that we've just been listening to will be available to the public from Saturday the 11th of June, which is the first day of this year's Highgate Festival. And during the festival will be audio players and headphones that are available to borrow from the chapel, and everyone's invited to come and experience the soundscape in the cemetery as it was intended by Trevor, and as we've just been able to do this evening. For anyone unable to come to the cemetery, a video version of the soundscape will be published online on the 20th of June for a limited time. All attendees to tonight's event will have a special preview link for this video available until midnight, Friday the 10th of June. Sounds like a spell. And then finally, on Friday the 24th of June, Lux will be hosting a unique performance event on Midsummer Night, where Trevor will be expanding upon where the conversation began through tonal poetic movements, reflective visuals from Highgate Cemetery, and experimental spoken word. So please join us there. And so it was that I held the watering can and my mother the secateurs, as we briskly set about the now familiar routes through our much-loved Highgate Cemetery. The task in hand was a midsummer graveside, weeding and pruning, straightening and sorting out, making my father look respectable. It was an inclement morning, thick with the tang of wet, earthy smells. Not a morning for pausing at the huddles of hellebores, clustered in their melancholy colours between ancient stones, or marvelling at the unruly parties of forget-me-nots running riot through the trees. A cool, sad June morning in 2020, London locked down and locked into a new reckoning with the ghosts of empire, rattling their chains in syncopated time with the beat across the Atlantic, where fault lines shuddered at the murder of George Floyd. This is where the conversation began. Turning right at Marks, straight onto the mound, where on a sunny day, the warmth of the stone at Stuart's grave still gives one a temporary brush with his vitality. What would he have made of it all? What turn will this dialogue with history take? What are the stakes and the conditions of belonging to the new territories being claimed? And so it was that we joined the community of Highgate visitors who talk, sometimes aloud, to their loved ones lost. Words alighting in the trees, nestling under stones, settling in the soil. Fragments of conversation given a new home in this extraordinary palimpsest of sounds and states and feeling that Trevor Mathison has brought for our attention today. I would like to thank him and his assistant editor, Beverly Bennett, on behalf of the family and the Stuart Hall Foundation for this work and for the invitation to pay attention. I would also like to thank Ian Dungavel and the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust for listening, to the Arts Council and Elephant Trust for their funding, to Ben Cook and Lux for their collaboration, Caro Communications for their PR support, and to Jelaine, the trustees, Harriet, Alsod and Ilza, our team at the Stuart Hall Foundation for pulling this off. Thanks to everyone who's contributed and supported this project. Stuart was never going to be buried back home in Jamaica. There was no such home place to return to. In the end, one has to find a position, he always said. And it was the once strange lime trees of northwest London, not the glade of an illusory mango grove, or the dusty yards of Constant Spring, which finally felt most familiar. The home he made with my mother, the family, friendships, political projects, cultural studies, collectives of Birmingham and Kilburn, the Open University, Black British artists, generations of students, at his typewriter, teaching, through intellectual inquiry, and always in conversation. Perhaps it could have been anywhere. Stuart really was a modest man, but his choice of Highgate Cemetery was a rare admission that his life, his contribution had earned him a proper place, and that he wished in death to claim it. He described on film in later life the lonely feeling of being out of sync with the times, not out of touch, but no longer quite in step. I think the prospect of being resettled in the company of old friends in this beautiful place, among the traditions of radical thought, near enough to home and in British soil, must have felt a good place to rest. Highgate is most likely filled with venerable ghosts, the serious nature of radical tradition setting the tone amongst its residents. It's not easy to get a place here after all. I trust that Stuart has smartened up his act since his hammy performance as the ghost of MacPhail in a piece of family theatre on a damp Scottish holiday. An eerie homemade soundtrack on the tape recorder as he stepped forth from the dusty drake for the high windowsill, swathed in an ancient eiderdown and holding forth kicker to the great alarm of the younger members of the audience. I hope there is room for such playful spirit in Highgate, and suspect that it was Stuart's mischievous midsummer sprite, his rebellious insistence on using as many exclamation marks as he fancied, that conjured up in me on that cool June morning, in the grim gloom of racialised violence, the disgrace of the unwelcomed Windrush arrivals, and those without leave to remain, the wish to rattle, the urge to make a stink. You have a black body here, make it matter. I feel an email coming on, I said, rousing a smile in my mother at the ridiculous prospect of me rolling my terrible eyes and gnashing my terrible teeth, putting in a spirited performance as the custodian of my father's reputation. And so it was that at 9:03 on Midsummer's Day 2020, I wrote an email to the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust, imperiously entitled Query. At 11:53 on that same morning, Ian wrote back, and an old-fashioned conversation began. We last stood in this chapel to bury Stuart, and never thought at that time that the Miles Davis Blues and Greens that my brother chose to play us out would ever bring us back in new dialogue with such old tunes. Trevor has chosen Familiar Stranger, the unfinished, posthumously recovered text that Stuart was working on until he died, his late life efforts to lay out and lay down the unrest of his own history, to speak in a new arrangement. It is the book in which the uneasy rhythm of Stuart's lifelong preoccupation with what it was he left behind sings out like his love of the blues, as it always did with what he made of his arrival. And so it is that we come here in memory and with the necessity of new things, the frost and verdant greens of new shoots, a landscape that speaks with the past to the urgency of the times.
Thank you so much, Becky, and hello everybody, welcome. I'm Aasiya Lodhi. I am from the University of Westminster, absolutely delighted to be here this evening to welcome Trevor Mathison to discuss his piece. The conversation continues, we are still listening, which is a sonic response to the legacy of Stuart Hall and a dialogue with the histories embedded here at Highgate Cemetery. Before I introduce Trevor formally, I've been told to tell you all that we're going to be in conversation for about 20 minutes. So after that, there'll be about another 20 minutes for you all to ask questions. So please do feel free to chip in with any comments and questions afterwards if you want the conversation to be expansive. And those of you that are watching online, please write your questions in the chat box. Is that right? Is that what we're going to do? And then we'll include those as well. Okay. So Trevor is a sonic artist, a musician, a composer, and a sound designer. His artistic practice developed over some 40-odd years and brought us a series of haunting and arresting soundscapes that have sought to engage audiences in conversations with the complicated cultural political histories of Britain. At the same time, Trevor's soundscapes have themselves been in dialogue with acoustic boundaries, challenging auditory convention through sonic pushbacks and provocations, and through a lasting exploration of the complex relationship, sometimes harmonious and sometimes discordant, between sound and moving image. As a founding member of the Black Audio Film Collective in the early 80s, Trevor's work is featured in over 30 award-winning films, including Signs of Empire, Handsworth Songs, The Last Angel of History. His work is characterised by a deep engagement with the textures of archival sound, including speech, song, recorded atmosphere, and further interwoven with music, contemporary readings, spoken word, poetry, and a range of other elements to create hypnotic, often pensive or melancholic, aural landscapes, reflecting on the complications, I think, of British cultural heritage. Trevor has founded a number of experimental sonic groups, including Double Morphology, Hallucinator, and Flow Motion, specialising in site-specific installations and large-scale ambient scores, and in collaboration with his former Black Audio Film Collective colleagues, especially director John Aconfra, he has continued to create sound design for a number of non-fiction feature films, such as The Nine Muses or the Stuart Hall Project. Described once as a centrifugal force in the construction of a Black British cultural aesthetic, Trevor said he conceives of his audience in the broadest term possible, hoping that anyone interested in history and memory will enter into a dialogue with his work. So please would you join me in welcoming Trevor Mathison. Trevor, I wanted to begin by asking you about the pull of Highgate Cemetery. We just heard Becky's wonderful introduction about its role in prompting her sort of stink, as she called it, raising a stink, as a site from which to explore, that relationship between Stuart Hall and other radical thinkers who have taken root in British culture and society, and some of whom are laid to rest here. What's its particular significance, do you think, and what was its particular pull for you?
One of the pull was that we were talking before, was the connection between like St. Paul's with the way that St. Paul's has certain people buried or laid to rest there, and Highgate as another space of idea. Well, especially other thinkers, other people are buried. That's one of the first things I realised, that there's a community of cultural ideas and many other historical people and other. That's the bit I thought was interesting, is the coming together of different historical timelines, and that was also one of the interesting things.
Yeah, and the sort of the radical tradition, I guess, in a way that's probably a contrasted support, maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a clear different power relationship, I guess, between the two of us. But then this is the space of ideas again. One of the things I realised, that lots of people came from outside to be here, or to be here again. So that's also the thing that I thought was interesting, that people travelled to England and stayed, but enriched the space as well. That's
Yeah, we'll come back to that idea, because I think the soil being actually enriched with the histories of these thinkers is really important in your piece. We heard earlier from Stuart Hall's daughter, Becky, there, I think she was sort of hinting at it, a kind of certain modesty maybe about his intellectual stature, which we're kind of celebrating this evening. And I think that was also sort of reflected in a way in terms of the actual location of his grave, which is on the east side of the cemetery, which is the less grandiose side of this cemetery. It's not particularly covered by, statuesque trees. It's not raised on a plinth. It's not shouting out loud about its kind of monumentality. Does that capture something important, do you think, about Stuart Hall's kind of intellectual practice and, his relationship with artists and thinkers and other intellectuals?
I think that's one of the powers, is that is able to bring such an eclectic group of people around the table to talk, or to be in the space of ideas and share, to be that person that everybody can identify as being, what's the word? Able to bring such a disparate group of people together, or even find commonality in ideas. And I think that's one of the powers. Even where the Stuart rested now, you can hear while you're listening to like children playing around. So there's already a space of movement still going. It's not like a still space, it's still a space of activity. So it's not like you're away from people, the sound of people is still present. I'm trying to think of it. We were talking before, one of the things I realized, like, is when you said setting up or being part of Innova, was the idea of we need a space to come to talk, and this was the thing. I thought, man, this guy is able to bring all of these different actors or characters into play. I mean, have the largesse to sort of see the power of that project being important, and again the work for Open University, the work in Birmingham. So you've done all of this. One thing alone would have been enough, but to be connected in that way, you're like, okay.
You first encountered him by watching him on
watching him
on University.
Yeah. Who is this guy? And it's like late at night. Okay, because they used to show the stuff like late and early in the morning. So when you see this black man talking, you try to make sure that that was like an interesting introduction to the space of ideas, and that it was eloquent, poetic, playful. You have to sort of, and then when you try to find it again, it's like there's a guy with a beard and woolly jumper doing some serious maths. I'm not quite sure where that guy came, or was it an anomaly, it was interesting just to see that, then to sort of see Stuart at the Commonwealth Institute, one of those sessions, and it was in the background, and I heard this powerful voice. Okay, let's look at some art now. But no, but it was still, it was great. It's great. It was a part of the armory that we had to make our work, or make sense of making work. That you could draw upon this this fountain of possible ideas. Literally saying, you're not alone. If you work together, we can make this thing happen. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's amazing. There's a lot of resonances, and we'll come back to that point as well. But something that's also emerging from what you just said there, I think is, and relates directly to your practice, is this idea of sort of listening and being, listening as an important aspect of being in dialogue. I'm thinking a lot of here, a book that I think is wonderful, just by the academic David Scott, which is called Stuart Hall's Voice, which is really about sort of his voice as his kind of, the mediation of his intellectual inquiry, I guess. But a huge part of that, I mean, David Scott says, he was an agent of attunement and receptivity. But to me, that sort of receptivity is like absolutely, embedded in the willingness to listen. So how much has that also shaped your own work? Always kind of wanting to foreground listening as a social, a political, a radical act to foster solidarity, to foster kinship.
I did a lot. It was far simpler than that. My answer would be, because I had to do it because it was part of my job. I mean, I was a sound recorder, so I had to listen to people chatting. So that was a part.
And that was a random thing, wasn't it? Yeah. Because how did you end up with the sound role?
I was just, like you have a hat, you have the names of tasks. So I put my hand in the sound recorder. So it ended up being. I worked on a film with Julian, I think. It was many years ago, and it just became a part of a learning school, the extra lessons to do stuff. So what I'm basically saying is that listening was a part of my thing. So recording and listening, so that became a part of it. But also it became a part of the practice that we've been in the collective. We had to find a way of being with each other, and part of that is listening to each other's sort of ideas and making those things physical and making in reality, or finding a way of making it happen or coming to life or coming to being. So that's also a thing. So the library of ideas that we all had was put into the pool, and we shared those ideas and information. So my shortfalls may be supported by another insight. And that's also part of the gig.
A collective practice.
Yes, we're stronger together by sharing our strengths and our weaknesses. Is again part of the thing.
It's hugely important, yeah. So your piece itself, which we've obviously been lucky enough to hear, those of us that are here in Highgate, it starts. Of course, not here, but it starts with that journey from Stuart Hall's native Jamaica to the British Imperial Metropole. And of course, as we heard earlier, we know that so eloquently captured in the title of his memoir, that sets in a set of processes of profound experiences of familiarity and an estrangement, the familiarity of the British colonial motherland, the estrangement of processes of othering and racialization and so forth. How have you tried to capture sort of familiarity, strangeness, if you like?
Because I felt that within the text that he knew this place by his education. He knew this place. He knew the place that he was coming to. But then the reality of the place changed, became more real. So that was my thinking was, okay, I want to map the space before and do that slight change, like the incidental sound of radio signals and then water, and then the sound of the city coming back into play. So it's just that sort of transition. So, but I knew that Stuart knew England before he arrived in England. That was one of the things I was trying to. So then it's like, is my imagined space real? Does it match up to what I've been taught? Does it match up to my expectations of what? And that's also the part of affirmative, or it's a part of the. That I thought was important to get a sense of like the journey that we go on, that our families and other members would take to take a decision to go to live in another place or to work. That's the big.
I thought something that really stuck out to me in terms of the sort of, I guess, the estrangement, if you like, in sound, because I'm a former radio producer and I'm trained in very strict BBC parameters. There are quite a few BBC colleagues here probably attest to that. Where we're literally, there are very strict regulations about the mix, the balance, as we would call it, between sound and music, especially, and voice. So voice must always be foregrounded and music must be faded under. And what I thought was really wonderful and notable about your piece was the way in which the readings done wonderfully by Joseph Black, but we'll also hear later, especially at the start of the piece, they were not mixed at all like that, so they're kind of held under, or they're mixed. You have to tune in really hard, you have to listen hard to hear for the text and for the voice. So how much were you trying to make a comment there about sort of, the struggles of being heard, but of course also the sort of weight of history in a way, certain configurations of history, and also making it a kind of ghostly presence?
Well, one part of it is like I wanted to have the experience that the voices accompanying you on this walk through the cemetery. So it's not necessarily in front, it's behind you or beside you, or just that little way in the distance. So you're listening through the space to hear what's on the tape, but also the space around you as well. Literally the physical space. So it changes. It's changeable. So it's not like I'm trying to push you into one position. I want the voice to be more fluid experience. That you're also just being in the moment, I guess. That there's a voice that, again, like I have a conversation overheard, or there's this like a gentle pause where you hear voices and then you move on. So I didn't want to, I recognize the aesthetics of the BBC program, but I'm not.
I can tell.
I've got a little bit of wiggle room. So.
Yeah, well, your aesthetics, I mean, if you think back to your, the very early
Well, I think what you're saying, I'm not going to get a job with the BBC. I can take criticism.
They'd be lucky to have you.
Yeah, let's start campaign. Would you want to work there at the BBC?
The parking facility. I think the sandwiches are supposed to
well, let's just talk about the aesthetics then, because I mean, that's sort of starting with the Black Audio Film Collective, and I think today, all the way through those 4 decades, it's characterised your work by an aesthetics of, I think you define yourself as collage, by certain techniques, specific techniques like music concrete, based on recorded sound, but also, as I said earlier, this very deep engagement with archival sound. And of course, in this piece, we hear, as we, mentioned and discussed, the sort of colonial era newsreel commentary about Jamaica. And on the other side, we also hear the sort of sounds of mid-20th century London. We hear the flower sellers as a woman kind of selling violets. It really reminded me of sort of Audrey Hepburn, who plays a violet seller, right? It's like My Fair Lady. And that was just, to me, it just so encapsulated your continual dialogue with colonial archive, the sound of colonial archive, but colonial memory. Why has it been such a...
Because it's so rich with potential. It's still worth going back and listening, finding those little moments of insights that you can take out or put us alongside something else. So you're constantly in dialogue with that frozen text or that frozen word or that attitude or tone that you can re-sculpt or remodel to tell another part of the story. So the watermark of history is still running through these pieces, and you can revisit it by finding a methodology that enables you to deconstruct and reconstruct a sonic or visual narrative or a visual narrative. So that's what I think the particular methodology which is born out of the experience of being part of Black Audio Film Collective and working with John and David and me and everybody. That is my happy moment, because my obsessions were able to find a playground for experimentation, and then put it in service of something that was of great meaning. So I'm pleased to continue to find that way of working is still of use now. That analysis of that sort of creative freedom to that.
But it's I think you said to me once, it's a non-destructive engagement in a way with the archive, isn't
absolutely,
it?
because the piece is still there. So it's like, what we do with it? Okay, if you don't like it, it's okay. But the original text or the original line is still there to be engaged with. What we're giving you is our interpretation, or the frame outside of that moment, or that insight, or when the cameras turn off, what happened afterwards, or the other kind of possible interpretation. But it is trying to give new light or new breath to that incident or that moment or that scene, because sometimes it either is being not seen or heard in a particular way, and we have a particular angle, we put it in service, or find a way of manipulating it.
Is it also about sort of avoiding didacticism? That really seems to me that's really important to you as well, not making blunt comment necessarily.
Because sometimes I don't think well, other practices may work well for them, but it doesn't work so well for us or for me. I might rather be more open for change or insights or new analysis or anything.
At the end of the piece, we actually hear Stuart Hall's own voice, so we also hear from wonderful poet Selina Woody, who reads a poem she's written specifically for the programme. At the end, we hear Stuart's voice, and again, I'm just thinking David Scott's book, and this idea of the grain of Stuart's voice. And I'm sort of interested because Stuart Hall also wrote a lot about ideas of, he called it multi-accentuality. He didn't mean multi-accentuality in terms of your literal accent. He meant sort of ideas around social relations, around class and other sorts of categories. But I'm interested in how they intersect, right? The kind of lived embodiment of the voice, that grain of the voice, which I think comes together with Stuart Hall's own ideas about sort of class and race and other types of accents, if you like. How did you sort of react to Stuart's actual voice? And you told us about sort of seeing him on the television.
You realise that you're listening to a very intelligent man, a deeply intelligent man, deeply considerate of the thing that he did. I come to this country to learn, and he learned. He put his work in all of that energy in service of something. And that voice is well owned of ideas, and
it's got the seawater sound.
Yeah, it's a poetry.
It's got the seawater sound of his Caribbean.
Yeah, I think you see the work that had been done. You can hear in the timbre and
yeah. I think one of the things it's really hard, again, just thinking about archives again, how much erasure there is. There's not many recordings of the very earliest engagements that Stuart had with BBC Radio, for example, which is my area of interest. But I think from the early 60s onwards, we can hear him. And what's really remarkable is how similar he sounds. If you listen to him, the earliest recording, he sounds almost the same. There's a real sort of, I think he's very comfortable in his voice. There's a sort of comfortable habitation of it, which perhaps, I don't know if you would agree with that or not. But I think he was sort of all these kind of, difficulties in a way, they're sort of encompassed and they were a sort of,
I think he weighs up each word and knows its value. And that's what we're hearing, is that there's a considered mind behind those words. That's what I think. You were saying, I was thinking of the desert island this one, is it Miles Davis? Just refers to that. You can feel the love of the music. Okay. This is if you can get so emotional over that, you're good. It's like, I can't say more than that. Like, you can hear it in the voice.
I think you can, yeah. Okay, that's a perfect moment. Shall we open up for some questions? Are there any questions from anybody here in the audience at Highgate? There is one there, yeah. There aren't any mics, so I think we just have to shout and I will repeat the question.
I just wondered if you've ever done any work in a cemetery before and what it was like to work in a cemetery. There's such there's such a lot going on.
Yes.
And this one obviously is, the Victorian kind of monumentality of it. You get that sense in the other Victorian cemeteries as well, but then obviously there's always the kind of tenderness of cemeteries and what people have wanted to say about their loved ones on stones, and that obviously sometimes that's kind of odd juxtaposition, these kind of grand monuments, but yet that people want to be, the crypts, people want to be with the bodies of their loved ones. And I just wondered what it was like as a space to work in for you.
Yeah, I've done some stuff. I was photographic and video pieces in cemeteries. Because of the stillness again and nature taking over. That's part of this, and we're seeing how to, and now we represent how we represent passing, or the iconography with the angels, the broken columns, all of those sort of pieces I find quite interesting. And then, especially in this century, how nature is struggling with concrete. There's a tension between nature is remodeling the space. That I find quite interesting. A place of stillness, there's constant movement.
So I think Selina, I'll just chip in very quickly, Selina Moon's poem is sort of in the voices of the flora and fauna of the cemetery, which is sort of this idea that the soil itself is enriched by the history itself.
That's all. I didn't really say it properly, but that is also the thing I'm thinking that is there. But it's the library of minds is here, of ideas. And those ideas are still powerful now. And I've not fully run its cycle. That's what I'm thinking. And that's the magic for that part. We still need that insight still.
I think there's another question back there.
I wonder if you could say something, Trevor, about the non-verbal sounds in the piece and about the relationship between stillness and movement.
Yeah, one of my sort of interests is the idea of not sonic negative space, but the idea that there's a granular quality to the sound of the trees, or the wind, or the breeze, or even plants can be used. So that's part of the thing that I've been playing with, or trying to find a way of building a sonic backdrop that allows other things to sit, text or spoken word, to sit on top of or inside it. So I like, I'm a noisy geezer, so I like sort of tonal qualities, but which can be sort of reconstructed and put inside. Yeah. I take the little gaps in things and sort of stretch them out and make epic sort of things that happen.
Because there's this big sort of ambient interlude in your piece, really, where it's sort of they're on, there's no words there, and it's sort of, it's interesting because obviously the pace slows right down and then there's a dramatic rise in momentum, but of course you haven't predetermined here a route that you should take.
We should
So
find
it's so open-ended, right, that we could be walking around this road and here and now, we could be walking to other bits. And I thought that was really important.
So one of the things I really liked is the footsteps. There's this constant, like you're walking alongside somebody or somebody's walking alongside you. So then you're in that moment of like, okay, and then this tone that sort of sits with you. Okay, so that's it. Then you can hear the space itself. You can hear the birds in the trees, not just what's on the wood, but the tree, you know, the birds, the wind. And each time you visit the space, the environment is different. But this is the constant. But you're starting to hear it in relationship to the sounds outside. And then you're making a new piece of, a new sonic experience, which is one line, but the environment adds this overlay, another layer, another texture to the experience. So it's trying to find a way that is open enough to be open to new experiences, which is constantly changing.
Thank you. Question from online?
Yeah, we've got a question from one of our Zoom attendees. Adiola is asking, what of the Caribbean way of becoming, how we were forged, facilitates their presence at the head of change, resistance, and revolution in the metropole? So I guess, yeah, how the Caribbean way of becoming, yeah, facilitates that presence as involved in change.
A way of becoming, I think, is in terms of change, in terms of Caribbean heritage.
Yeah. One of the strengths of being Caribbean is that we're constantly changing. We're constantly open to change, because that's what happens when we survive so much. If we weren't able to be fluid, that's strong, that's solid, you know, we wouldn't be here. That's our strength, we need to adapt to each environment and make it our own again. This is that sort of Afrofuturist kind of thing as well, because we are that idea we're in an alien environment, but we have to make it work for us. And it's the other way around, that you've been taken from your planet, your world, and you're placed in an alien environment, and you've still got to survive and raise children and have dreams and desires. So, yeah, if nothing else, that's what makes us stronger.
I have a strange material comment to make, which is that, you know, every time I come back to see what's happening on Stuart's grave, the clay has gathered. London clay is so unmalleable. It's so difficult to deal with. I have to attack it. And it's like, that's the, you know, all his fluidity, his mobility, his capacity to listen and to change. It's like the clay is fighting him. London, you know, has a kind of, I mean, it was both a place he could be in, but it was never a place he could belong any more than he could belong any longer in Jamaica. And there's something strange about that in relation to the grave, that, you know, we put these plants in and they struggle against the clay. And if you've been down there today, you will have seen, I mean, the rose can bloom. The rose gets bigger and bigger. The rose tries to cover his stone so that nobody can see who he is. And then the other herbs that I've put in, they get absolutely demolished by the clay and by all the other flowers that arrive from the cemetery, which are just, you know, the seeds that arrive. So all those blue flowers, we didn't put them in. They're all part of the natural life of the cemetery.
But that's the same thing they said.
Yeah.
The trees are not naturally planted. They're taking seed in the space, and they're making it their own again.
I mean, it has its own life. It
Yeah.
absolutely has its own life, but it also has its own struggle with the sediments.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
feels like the clay is the sediments of London and the metropole and all of that. There's something quite vivid about that.
But it is what London is built on again. It's the thing that is the foundation again.
Yeah.
Of London is. It's either dug out from somewhere else, put to over here to make the canals, and it's literally it is the thing that all economics is
Absolutely. But also the clay makes it move.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it made us laugh because Becky said, oh, he's moved to the left. You know, the whole thing had kind of shifted and we had to reset it. So it's the life of the dead in the cemetery, which is very powerful.
Because again, the same thing, like there's movement in this space. I think the plants are going to shift the what seems to be a monument through time, but it says, no, give us time, we will get round you, or we'll grow over you, or we will, embrace you again. So it is that. And maybe that is one of the cultural struggles. It is time to see the ideas have its moment. As in Marx's ideas gone through the cycle. Now people have to find their relationship to it that makes sense for them to fit the world that they're imagining or desiring to construct. Or to
You have to go on believing in the dialectic.
Yeah.
Things change.
Yes, yeah, and that's being open to change as well.
Thank you. I think this is one first, and then I think yes.
Well, I'd like to make an observation, ask a question about long ago. Listening to the soundscape, hearing Stuart talk about what it was like talking to his tutor in Oxford, and his tutor making the remark that he might go back and become the governor there, which I thought was a completely stupid idea, actually. I thought about the fact that I met Stuart a few years after that in New Left Club meetings in London, and then watching him on platforms at the end of Aldermaston marches. And there he was with fellow speakers who were eminent figures, since we're talking about the radical tradition in the cemetery, radical figures from the left at the time, including Raphael Samuel, who was buried here, and Charles Taylor and Michael Foot and Fenner Brockway and Bertrand Russell and all those people. So there was Stuart, really very greatly appreciated and admired figure, speaking on these various platforms. And he's not ever, I've never heard him write about or talk about what it was like in that company. We know what it was like in Oxford, because he said it was peculiar, and we know what it was like in Birmingham, which was difficult, and so on and later. So he's talked a lot about the difficulties of being a person of colour in the British environment. But then there he was on a platform, greatly admired and loved really by the audiences of both kinds. He was always the most interesting speaker at all those Aldermaston marches and so on. What was it like for him being in that company? Did he feel in that company, well, this was okay because now people didn't mind that I was a person of colour? And of course, I think what we all felt listening to him was his wonderful voice. It was sensational to listen to him, and that's what one was aware of, that he was so different and so wonderful. Not that he was black, really. That didn't seem to be the kind of issue for the Aldermaston marchers or for the New Left audiences. But he's not written about that, to my knowledge. There's a kind of gap between what he has to say about Oxford and what he has to say about all the difficulties later on. And it's a shame, really, because of course you can see Stuart speaking in those marches when you look at the account for a film. It's not that it's not on the record, but what's not on the record is what people thought about it, and indeed what he thought about it. That's just the point I wanted to make.
That's a good point.
That's a good point. I think he does mention it in his memoir, though, isn't there? Just a line or two where he says he was talking to Catherine about that he doesn't, that the new left intellectuals never see race as a kind of, or his, you know, him as a racialized person, or having really dealt with the kind of, you know, the sheer weight of that process, not really ever appreciating that. I think there is a sort of, there's a very small comment about that, because I always remember thinking, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Which is that, of course, it was nodded to, but never really appreciated. I don't think he felt it was appreciated enough, but probably, Catherine, you might have more to say on that. Right, sorry, lady behind.
I was wondering how you arrived at a tone for your sound piece, because you're bringing together lots of different elements, poetry and readings and performance, and Stuart's voice, and then your own, bringing together archival voices and music and sound. I wonder how you arrived at a tone that you felt spoke to who Stuart was and what the project.
It started when we, with Beverly, we then came around the cemetery and was taking photographs and videos. And I found, reviewing material, I realised things would be slowed down. So it could be a slow sort of pace. And it was raining, and I realised you can actually see like the droplets of rain that's bouncing off the air stuff and stuff. So I knew that the pace was going to be slow, so it wasn't anything that needed to be rushed. So I wanted it to be thoughtful, in the sense that I was imagining Stuart visiting the cemetery when he came to England. So when he was in London, I thought, oh, what would it be like if he visited this space? That's one of the things. So I realised I needed it to be a certain with tone. So lots of the tone of pieces I've been building as a particular sort of quality, and that was one of the thinking. So it had to be, wanted it to not be rushed. By collecting the other elements of the art, the archive pieces, it seemed to make sense to be sort of taking it easy, apart from this flight. It's going on.
Okay. I think a very quick one, I think, last question.
Thank you. I was wondering, I was thinking about how we've experienced audio differently over time. And I imagine that the time when you first started working with audio, people experienced it differently, and now we spend so much time walking around spaces with podcasts and audio books and music, and we're like saturated with audio and information through that, but walking around the cemetery in a sort of considered way with your audio felt quite different. So like how it might feel just walking around London with a podcast or a piece of music on. And I guess I wanted to ask that, you know, just by the very nature of turning on a speaker, you're experiencing the community because other people can hear it, and was it important to you to create a sort of solo experience for each listener?
That was one of the restrictions, or one of the we knew we had to have a piece that would be in some tune. Otherwise we'd put speakers around, but it felt right to be more internal kind of experience. But also for me, when I'm walking around the city, sometimes I'm listening to people talking, there's cars, there's music, and so that you get this sort of cut up of possible reimagining situations where you don't plan for, but you get introduced to, and they become like the sonic soundtrack to that journey to the corner market, to your shopping or whatever. But it's sort of like these sort of small little parcels of sound that you pull together that makes a thing. And I think this is, it's like little micro cut-ups of random elements that make a piece happen.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time, so thank you again to everybody, and thank you to Trevor Mathison for sending We're going to conclude this evening's proceedings with a reading from Familiar Stranger. Oh, this isn't coming. It's a wonderful sound thing for the chapel. You've actually chosen some excerpts from Familiar Stranger to be read by Joseph Black. Can you tell us very quickly what you chose?
I think I'll leave it to Joseph just to do his thing.
Okay, I think you're just going to read. Okay, Joseph,
Yeah.
if you don't mind joining some people to read us out. So thank you again, everybody. And now it's Joseph Black.
Thank you very much. I've heard my voice is quite booming, so we'll move this microphone right over here. Hopefully everybody can hear me still at home. This is on page 52 of Familiar Stranger, A Life Between Two Islands. Wonderful book, everybody read it honestly. Okay. We arrived in August, and since the Oxford term didn't start until October, we spent a few weeks in London as tourists. We stayed at Methodist International House, a kind of refuge for overseas students in Bayswater. Among the first people I met there were A.N.R. Robinson, subsequently both Prime Minister and President of Trinidad and Tobago, who was studying law at the Inns of Court and was soon to be a founding member of the People's National Movement. And Doris Welcome from British Guyana, who became the first wife of the celebrated Barbadian poet, Edward Camus Braithwaite. The house was full of African, Asian, and Caribbean students. It was self-consciously international in ethos. Native dress, whatever that was. At weekends, food from different regions, many languages. There was a more religious atmosphere than either I or my mother was accustomed to. Grace at meals, hymns around the piano of an evening. Chapel on Sunday morning. However, it did give me the chance to acclimatize slowly to London in a place which was not impenetrably English. And then one day, I came to see that impenetrable England wasn't impenetrable at all. Passing Paddington Station, which was only around the corner from Bayswater Terrace, I saw a stream of black people spilling out into London afternoon. They were too poorly dressed tourists. Who were they? And what were they doing here? In fact, this was my first encounter with an advanced guard of what became Black Caribbean, post-war, post-Windrush migration, which over the years has transformed Britain. One world intruded on another. This was a game-changing moment for me. Suddenly, everything looked different. It is hard to reconstruct the effect of seeing these Black West Indian working men and women in London with their strapped-up suitcases and bulging straw baskets, looking for all the world as if they planned a long stay. They had made extraordinary efforts within their means to dress up to the nines for the journey, as West Indians always did in those days when traveling or going to church. The men in soft brim felt hats, cocked at a rakish angle. The women in flimsy, colorful cotton dresses, stepping uncertainly into the cold wind, or waiting for relatives or friends to rescue them from the enveloping strangeness. They hesitated in front of ticket windows, trying to figure out how to take another train to some equally unfamiliar place, to find people they knew who had preceded them. Their minds seemed fixed, not on some mythic romance of travel or on the equally unpersuasive notion of an unfolding adventure, but on the immediate practicalities: a place to sleep, a room to rent, work. For them and for me, this was a fateful moment of transition, frozen in time. The sight of all these Black people in the center of London was astonishing. What I thought I had left behind as an unresolved dilemma, the difficulties my family background had bequeathed to me of neither wanting any identification with my own social stratum, nor being able to feel present in my own homeland, conscious of the chasm that separated me from the multitude, had turned up to meet me on the other side of the Atlantic. This made me feel like I was traveling forwards towards the past. These were still early days, and migration carried the promise that it would level the colonial playing field. Here, at last, we all were what Sheila Patterson, in her early study of post-war migration, called dark strangers, travelers in unfamiliar territory, puzzled about what the future held, fearful about whether we would survive, unsettled by how different everything seemed, and worried by how much the experience would change us. I had anticipated all sorts of new beginnings, but I never imagined London would secrete this explosive little time bomb from the past. Of course, any idea of making an absolutely new start had been a fantasy, and I don't think I ever succumbed to it. I was convinced my leaving Jamaica was a temporary break, and I fully intended to return and to spend my adult life there. In any case, as I subsequently discovered, the hope of making an absolutely new start, year one, is often the first of the illusions to go. Besides, it wasn't really a beginning, only another chapter in a long-running story which had begun centuries before.